This episode is proudly supported by Anchor Food Professionals, makers of mainland cheese. Here's Andy Sy from the Notting Hill Hotel.
We've been using them for a few years now, using their tasty and mozzarella cheese. We go through about 135 kilos a week at the moment. So a huge number. So we use it for our garlic bread, our pizzas, our parmas, our bechamel, our cheese sauce for our croquettes and arancini, throughout our lasagnas, anywhere we can really. It's such a good product. You know, having the freshest chips to your fresh chicken to a freshly crumbed schnitzel and topping up with a really high quality cheese is amazing.
For more information, go to anchorfoodprofessionals.com.
I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
We're not trying to make a wine that tastes like a handpicked wine. It ultimately should really be that mirror that reflects that inner nuance and charisma of those amazing sites.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Peter Dillon is the Chief Winemaker at Handpicked Wines. Born into a winemaking family, Peter's passion for the craft runs deep. Alongside his work in the winery, he's equally at home in the vineyard as Director of Viticulture as well. Peter's hands-on approach and curiosity for terroir keep him constantly engaged in the art and science of great wine. Thank you for joining me, Peter.
Thanks, Shanteh. Great to be here.
It is a delight to have another conversation with you. I do want to tell the listeners that the first time I met you in person, I was completely disarmed by your very open smile and this charming dimple that you have that I completely forgot what I was doing and what we were there for. And luckily, you're such a nice guy that you came to my rescue and I figured out what I was supposed to do, which was interview you. So thanks for being such a nice guy.
Well, thank you. I can only try. And it's always nice to chat about wine and enjoy the afternoon.
I bet it's not very often that you get somebody that's stumbling over their words and forgets who you are in person, but I certainly won't do it again. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up, Peter. I believe that you kind of born in kind of North Victoria, is that right?
Yeah, I was born in country Victoria in a town called Mansfield. So on the edge of the Mount Buller snowfields, because my parents were up that way teaching at a school campus on the edge of the mountains there. So I had probably an idyllic first few years of my life running around the bush and learning to ski as a wee little tacker before we upped and moved to Canberra.
Oh, interesting. I mean, it certainly sounds like you had a nice outdoorsy kind of childhood, which is what we all want really, isn't it? And Canberra is quite a picturesque place. What was the decision to move to Canberra with your family?
My parents were teachers and I think effectively an opportunity came up there at Canberra Grammar. So Mum and Dad decided to give that a go, and they'd had I think their university studies had both been at the ANU there in Canberra, so they knew the city and liked it. And I think as a family, we've probably always liked that time outside and in the mountains and those sorts of things. And that probably then went on to reflect that early childhood for me was that, I think what is good about Canberra is that it's quite close to the beach and the coast, but also quite close to the mountains. So that probably reflects in many ways the interests that I've inherited on the back of that upbringing.
The best of both worlds. And we are so lucky in this country that there are multiple places where you can be at the beach quite close and then be at a beautiful escarpment and in vast amounts of land as well. Does your family have connections to the wine industry?
It did, in the sense that my grandmother was a Lindeman. So she was part of the Lindemans family, which is a pretty significant name from the Hunter Valley. She grew up in the Kawara homestead there, which was I think it's now pictured on the Chardonnay that's, on the fairly cheap and cheerful shelves. That is the house that she grew up in as a girl, and her upbringing there, I think, was probably idyllic. The family would have sold it before she got involved in the business in a formal sense, but she had plenty of romantic stories of, crossing the creek via the Flying Fox in times of flood to pick up the milk and all those sorts of things. And I think in many ways that seeded the idea of the wine industry being interesting and a bit of an adventure for the future. So that sort of sparked my interest somewhat just from the time spent on her knee.
Amazing. I mean, she sounds like a wonderful woman. I think it's funny when people often ask us questions about, when did wine come into the picture? It's not until you really think about, stories like that where you think, no, I didn't immediately know I wanted to be a winemaker, but it probably had something in there that, like you said, maybe sparked some interest or thought this could be a bit of fun, or it kind of comes back in kind of full circle. Tell me, was she a wine drinker?
Most definitely, yeah. I think she probably died before I was properly drinking wine, but I believe she had a gold card to the cellar and all those sorts of things. So wine was something, a common thread through evening meals and talked about, and even I can recall her cooking this breakfast, which would be, I think it was effectively like a bechamel sauce on toast, which as a child I thought was Christmas, but that was, from my memory, heavily laced with quite a significant slug of white wine. So, yeah, there was always wine there somewhere along the way.
That sounds like an amazing meal. To be quite fair, whenever I make lasagna, I eat most of the bechamel sauce by the spoonful, and I feel quite sick by the time I get there. Yeah. So I can completely understand that.
100%. You can imagine, as a young boy, I thought that was paradise.
Now, tell me what it was like growing up and kind of going through high school. When did you start to think about kind of your future and what you wanted to do as a career?
I think I, as a child, I was always quite interested in food and cooking. So the idea of making wine was there in the background as a vague idea, and I suspect, as I say, I think seeded by my grandmother and perhaps father to some extent. But I also, because I enjoyed the outdoors and fly fishing in the mountains and those things, the idea of an industry and a job that would see that crossover with being outside, engaging in vineyards, flavours, that sort of rolled in that direction. And then probably sort of halfway through high school, I mean, I was much more a humanities student than a chemistry student. So I probably had a vague concern that that wouldn't go so well. So I sort of ummed and ahed a bit. And when I finished school, I didn't actually initially enroll in it, and I had a couple of years off between school and university. And then in that time, I was spending a huge amount of my time when I wasn't sort of working casual jobs, involved with food and wine. And the more I did that, the more I realised that it was probably worth giving a go. So then I went down to Adelaide and I dropped in on a couple of wineries, and I saw Pamela Dunsford at Chapel Hill, and I saw Larry Cherubino at Tintara, and sort of had a bit of a deep dive over a couple of days with each of them and walking around and looking at what was going on. And that then cemented my thinking that it was something I should give a go.
Incredible. I mean, the wine industry is known for being very generous, and I think, even more so when we look back over the years. I know we're all very busy now, but it sounds like you've had some good mentors from early on, seeing as you went to work later for Larry.
Yeah.
Tell me about, you did your degree at the University of Adelaide? I
did, yep. So that was full-time for 4 years, and ultimately a great experience. I think, it's such a great city in terms of the food and wine culture within Adelaide and across the state. Great mix of people at the course there with me who many of whom are still involved and kicking their own goals. And equally so close to the wine regions through uni. I was mixing my time working between sort of fine wine bottle shops like Edinburgh Cellars, and then I did quite a bit of work in McLaren Vale. I did my first vintage with Durrenberg, and then spent the rest of my time through uni working at a winery called Kangaroo Road, which was a bit of time pruning, but I ended up spending more and more time in the winery there.
Amazing. Now tell me, when you go through a degree like you did, there's always, like you said, a cohort of people, like-minded people you get along with. Who was the bad influence in your degree? Who was the person encouraging you to go out before that Monday lecture that you shouldn't be out for?
That would probably be a relatively easy answer, in that most of the instances of that would be one Julian Langworthy. But that said, it was also spoilt for choice in the year, so he wasn't alone in that in that role.
Now, I don't know all the people you went to, but if you did write them all down, I probably could have circled that one. That's a pretty fast bet. But you might have said you too, and then I would have been really surprised.
Oh, well, I think we all had our weak moments, and, possibly would choose differently now. But I think at the same time, we had probably quite a lot of fun going through that uni, and certainly we're occasionally worse the wear for it.
It is a rite of passage, and I don't think those friendships form without some of those experiences. So what was your first job? Was it at Constellation Wines when you first came out of uni?
Out of uni it was, but in the iteration when I started, it was actually still BRL Hardy. And I suppose in my mind that was different in the sense, so I went west to work at Horton. That was partly on the back of Larry Cherubino at the time was the chief winemaker in the west for Horton. And BRL at that point was still, in that more family-owned, I think it was publicly listed, but it came across as a much smaller corporate that was much more interested in really high-end premium winemaking and doing some amazing things there with the Cabernets and Shirazes particularly, and Chardonnay from the West. I'd been bumping into Larry at trade tastings in Adelaide, one thing led to another, and the job was offered, and away I went. And for me, I'd grown up on the East Coast. I'd studied in Adelaide, but that was a bit like the wild, wild west. It was sort of the new frontier for me. The idea of Margaret River Cabernet and Great Southern Shiraz and Riesling and the Chardonnays at the time from Pemberton and Margaret River. That was, something I was pretty intrigued to tackle and get a handle on.
And working with someone like Larry, who's such a visionary and really understands so much about all of WA. I mean, maybe there's bits up north he doesn't know much about, but incredible experience. And a lot of people go out to WA and don't really come back. But that changed for you. Is that when Handpicked made the call?
Effectively, and it was an interesting evolution for me. I mean, I'd enjoyed that West immensely, and there was a vast number, along with Larry, people like Robert Bowen and Peter Dawson. Steve Pannell was involved with the business when I first started. Very stimulating. Learnt a huge amount, and I did spend 12 years there. So I moved around a bit within that business across the sites that we had there. And I sort of had a moment, two things happened. One was that my wife, Imogen, became pregnant with twins, and that probably gave us pause for thought a little bit. The key site at the time that I was running was the Horton Nanup site, which was probably a bit over an hour's drive from home. And I was just conscious of wanting to be a bit closer to be on hand to help if I could, once these twins were due to arrive. So I did 10 years with that Horton business, finished just in time for the twins to arrive, and then had another 2 years in the West running things for Larry and the Oakley winemaking there across the southwest. But that meant I was living on the vineyard on site, and at lunchtime or whatever, that was pretty easy to go home and help juggle these new arrivals. But then from a winemaking point of view, there was also a moment where, it was a bit of a light bulb moment in some ways, where I realised that whilst I was in the heartland of Cabernet and Chardonnay and all these other amazing wines, most of what I was actually drinking at home was Pinot Noir. And whilst I was making some parcels from Pemberton and Manjimup and the Parongarups and places like that, which were quite amazing, it seemed like this sort of dark and mysterious grape variety that had so many nuances to it that I didn't quite have a handle on. And that was sort of the point where I really started to think that it was something that I should try and get stuck into. And fortunately for me, when I sat down and broached that topic with Imogen, my wife, who's also a winemaker, she also shares that interest and passion in Pinot Noir. And we also thought that whilst the kids were young, it would be worth, if there was a time to try those things, it was then. So that sort of timing then coincided with this role coming up. And for me at that point, it was, a dream come true, because there was this role that was effectively encompassing just about every premium Pinot Noir region in the the near vicinity of the Southern Hemisphere, across East Coast Australia and New Zealand, etc. So I jumped at it.
Well, I can imagine you jumping at that opportunity, because it sure is one hell of an opportunity. Tell me a little bit about what it was like in those first days working with Gary Baldwin.
Gary is one of the sages of the industry. I think his earliest vintages were 1978 in the Hunter Valley, which for me, that puts things in perspective. That was the year I was born. But he was still involved in the industry, incredible energy, humour, and passion for making good wine, which was both from a handpicked perspective, but also in that consulting role that he was operating with his own business. I think it was a great couple of years that we had together there, where we were sharing ideas as to how to evolve and grow the premium side of winemaking for handpicked. But also, I think in working with Gary just as a mate, I've judged quite a few shows with him and things like that. And I think, he's always just got that energy and underlying laughter and whatever else to how he approaches doing his jobs. It was good fun.
And when we talked a little bit about being in different areas and being near the beach and being by the mountains and the best of both worlds, working for Handpicked, you work in a few different, very different regions across Australia. Some would say it's the best of both worlds, because you are able to work with unique fruit and not have to just choose one winery that's placed in one spot.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about how you got your head around all the different sites when you first took on the role.
It was an interesting one, and I mean, I think that's one of those, for me, a fascinating sort of common thread in terms of that life journey through the industry, where in some ways the role I'm in now, I couldn't imagine a better seeding ground leading into that than the one I had at places like Hardy/Horton, because in that business I was operating as one of the senior winemaking team, and we'd come together and I'd look at wines that I'd made and with the other senior winemakers, but also wines that Dredgy had made in Tasmania, or Mark O'Callaghan had made in the Yarra, or et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, almost bizarrely, many of those growers that I had a connection with at that point in my life, I now have a connection with again today. So, you know, the industry continues to grow and evolve, but it remains a small industry. And I think probably that conversation and education that I had as a younger winemaker over 10 years ago has now really helped me have that flexibility and elasticity in terms of being able to think about what might need to be done in a vineyard or a winery when I'm walking a row in McLaren Vale or Barossa, as compared to perhaps walking a row in in the Tamar or Upper Yarra. Or even, you know, further afield, we've had some other projects like setting up some Pinot in Oregon or wherever else.
Well, you certainly have wonderful, you know, backing and wonderful insight into great business models with the people involved at Handpicked. They made a decision to become certified with Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, all of its sites. How has that process been? As we know, it's not something that happens swiftly.
No, I think it's been a really fascinating journey, and I think for us, well, and also the organic path, because we're the first producer in Victoria to be certified as both organic and sustainable, and first producer in Tasmania to hold that mantle. So, for want of a better expression, I'd say it was an organic path or an organic journey, because it sort of just evolved, and it happened that it made sense, because initially the thinking was, how do we make these wines better? Which for me, you know, we're always trying to find those little tweaks and differences that we can make that ultimately will lead to the wine being better next time around. And I think for me at the time, that thinking really quickly came back to make the best wine, we have to have the best grapes. And in a simple sense, that then started with the idea of vine health, soil health, and effectively composting, and trying to cut out the herbicide usage we had in a conventional model. And then the more we got involved with it, the more we sort of deep dived into it and went down the rabbit hole, the more we loved the responses that we were seeing by way of plant response and vine health, and ultimately the quality of the fruit coming out the other side. So the more we did it, the more it just made sense. So I think that was actually a really fulfilling journey, but you know, in many ways not one we initially set out determined that that's what we were going to do. Yeah.
And I imagine that some sites have been slightly harder for that organic conversion than others, or have you had its challenges in all of them?
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think every site has its intricacies and nuances and little difficulties, and it's probably partly why the journey has taken a bit longer for us, because of that diversity of sites across different regions. We decided deliberately that we wouldn't we wouldn't do it as a bull at the gate and do everything all at once, because we knew we were probably going to make mistakes along the way. And, you know, a classic example of that would be by taking herbicide out of the equation. There would be different approaches, but the way that we then decided to counter that was through cultivation under vine. And that's effectively this a mechanical process, attaching different tools to your tractor that, as you drive along, are taking out those weeds in some way, shape or form. And, you know, initially you probably buy 3 different tools. Effectively now, across all the sites, we have different tools at every site, and we've probably got 5 different types. Just because the soil's different, the grasses and the weeds that want to grow on the sites are different, all those sorts of things. So I actually think it required patience, but it was probably the right decision to make at the time, because otherwise you'd end up with a lot of redundant gear sitting in the shed gathering dust and not necessarily sort of using it to the full extent.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And I just think, you know, it's a lot to wrap your head around when you think of the job that you have. Tell me a little bit about, you know, you can't be in each place at the same time. Tell me a little bit about working with a greater team and how do you get the most out of them, the best communication? Is there any, you know, values that you think are you really hold dear that kind of allows that big network to work as one?
Good question. I think it certainly is success reliant upon that buy-in from the broader team. In a viticultural sense, we've got our group viticulturist Ben Bussell, and then we've got sort of site managers and assistant vineyard managers spread across the different regions that are really focused on the success of the vineyards. And then in a winemaking sense, here in Mornington, I've got Cam Wilson, and then in Tasmania, we've got Catherine Bevan and Peter McCauley. So it is still a tight and smaller team relative to the scope of the ground we've got to cover. And I think probably the underlying thread there is probably a passion for the sites and having that expression of sight coming through into the glass, where we're not trying to make a wine that tastes like a handpicked wine. It ultimately should really be that mirror that reflects that inner nuance and charisma of those amazing sites. So I think that's an important factor. In terms of the communication side of things, I don't think we're approaching it as you would a smaller family-owned entity. We're trying not to be corporatized in terms of the communication flow or anything like that. I think at the end of the day, we have to have that intimate communication lines and the sharing of the vision in order for that all to sort of gel and to work. And I think, it's always a great way to jinx yourself, but yeah, we've been blessed with amazing people throughout that journey. But the team we've got at the moment, just amazing in terms of that shared and collective sort of vision as to where we want to get to.
It must be a wonderful brand to be a part of. I mean, I think that you see that throughout the ranges that you have as well, the trial batches to the collection to regional to single vineyard. You see that there is such scope for creativity, I think, throughout those, but it's still such a reliable brand for somebody that walks into a bottle shop and, it might be, perhaps not a really independent, unique bottle shop, and they can go and they go in and they're like, oh, there's something from Handpicked there. And I think that that's really important in this day and age to have this consistency that people can rely on and know that if they pick up that bottle that they're going to like what's inside, depending on vintage as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's reflects certainly what we're trying to achieve. I think quality is ultimately our biggest priority in terms of delivering something that is a known reflection of those great sites that we're dealing with and operating in on a daily basis. And I think there's different layers to what we do. And as you touched on the trial batch, that can be really experimental and fun, but at the same time, that's not necessarily an excuse to completely stuff it up. So,
Well, you say that, but I think it's at risk to put trial on a label at all, but it's a hand-picked trial, which means a lot of thought's gone into it. So even I was surprised at some of those wines. I'm like, man, that's like a gold medal wine and it's still got trial written on it, So I think that just goes to show the confidence as well in what you're putting your energy into. It's not something that it's fleeting and you might do one vintage of and you're not invested. You know that there's promise there and it's at this stage for whatever reason. But I think there's some really exciting wines in those trial batches, and I think that they're at a really yummy price point. So I always kind of direct my friends to seek out some of those wines.
Yeah, awesome. Well, that's the idea, and I think in some ways the trial could be, it could be a challenge to the team to do something we haven't ever tried before in a winemaking sense, or it could be just a new variety that we haven't made before and think is interesting, and are playing around with and evolving over time, etc. So yeah, it's definitely fun.
Now you reside in the Macedon Ranges, Mornington Peninsula. I'm talking about Macedon Ranges, sorry. It's sitting right in front of me on a bottle. You reside in the Mornington Peninsula, and I do want to talk a little bit about your wife, because not only is she a absolutely fantastic winemaker, she also birthed twins. She's my hero. Tell me a little bit about the decision to move to Mornington.
Well, we did move. When we did move, the twins were still under a year old, and Im had senior winemaking roles in Margaret River. But obviously, when the twins had come along, that was a pretty big disruption to our lives, and she'd had time off work through that initial period to juggle that, and it just. My timing was terrible because she'd literally just gone back to work in a really cool chief winemaker role at Fermoy Estate. So when we then shifted, Mornington is, I think, an amazing region, which just has so much nuance to it and quite small in terms of planted area, 1,000 hectares. But this incredible range of sites and fruit profiles and all those sorts of things. The flip of that is that being one of the smaller regions, there was also limited roles and opportunities. So Im then started just to explore the opportunities that were around, and pretty quickly fell into a role at Yabby Lake, which I think was a fantastic start to her life on the peninsula. And I don't want to speak for her, but I know that time she had there with Tom Carson, she just values immensely. And I think he was just an incredible supporter and mentor for her in those early years on the peninsula. And then they had a couple of winemakers already, so she'd actually gone from a chief winemaker role in the west to a role in the cellar and lab there. And then a few years later, a winemaking role came up at 10 Minutes by Tractor, which is now where she's the chief winemaker, and loving her time there with Martin and Karen Spedding.
And thriving, absolutely thriving. I do think that perhaps over dinner tonight you could mention and put in a good word for me, because I have been trying to get Imogen on the podcast and she can tell me all about the sacrifices she had made.
Well, I'm sure she'd love to talk.
Good.
She's it'll have to wait though, because I won't see her tonight because she's busy judging Melbourne Wine Show this week. So she's
this week.
out working hard. But I'll mention it when I next see her.
She's also probably drinking some beautiful Burgundy wines.
No doubt.
At night time. So tell me, Peter, are you still learning in this role? Is there still lots more to learn? Do you ever kind of sit back at the end of the day and think job well done? Or is it always something more to be ticked off the list?
A bit of both. There's always more on the horizon, and I even think just in that sustainability and organic space, it's actually one of the exciting things for us to think about. Myself and from a team point of view, we're always sort of thinking what can we do next. I think the parts of sustainability that we initiated probably 10 years ago now would just be seen as almost the norm for many operators in the industry. So I think it's always interesting just to consider what's the next frontier, what's the next step. That's always at the back of your mind. But I think incredibly gratifying along the way when you see a vineyard change to the stimulus that you've put into place, and the levers that you've pulled have an effect which goes the direction that you'd hoped, and you see that response. Or when the wines that you make from those sites go on to, there's different levels of gratification there, whether that's in a formal sense, a review or a trophy somewhere. But I think even when you're just out somewhere and have a positive response from somebody who has been touched by that wine, and you can see they, I think in some ways it offers the chance to go on a bit of a journey through trying the wine, and I think something like a Wombat Creek Chardonnay, for example, highest vineyard in the Yarra, old vines, and when someone tastes those wines and you see that response in them where they're almost transported to that place, upper Yarra characteristics, but that old vine density and complexity, that's obviously very gratifying as well.
Yeah, well, I certainly think, these sites that you have been plucked out. They're like diamonds in the rough in the Yarra, Barossa, Mornington, Tassie. You have a wealth of beautiful places to craft your art form from, and I do think it is a job that many would claw your eyes out for, to be quite honest.
Well, yeah.
But luckily you're doing a wonderful job, Peter.
Unfortunately, I'm not going anywhere in the near future, but no, it is an amazing job. And yeah, I mean, really it does come back to those sites. We choose them carefully, and I think that really is probably at the heart of what we're doing.
And I do think that the culmination of all the things that you've done in your career, like you said, has built you to be the right person for this role now, and you can see that in the way that Handpicked is not just arranged in the bottle, but for the people that you work with, the respect of those people for what you do. It's very special and certainly has a wonderful reputation. I do want to know and learn a little bit more about you. If you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be?
3 beverages. I think number one, I would have to say I would probably be nothing without the morning cup of coffee. So that's, even though there might not be any alcohol involved, that's definitely in the mix. And then after that, it gets a little bit tougher. So I think I've got a friend in Tasmania who's distilling an amazing gin. So I think a bottle of their gin would be somewhere on the shelf, probably because, you know, it could be used in various versatile ways and might make a gin and tonic or a martini or whatever else. And that would then leave me having to choose some form of wine, which that I do struggle with, because I think, you know, I've talked about Pinot Noir being such an important driver in terms of my life, but I, you know, also have a pretty weak spot for things like the Chardonnays that we make or aspire to make, and you know, so many Italian varietals, etc. So I think it would depend on the time of year, etc. So given we're in spring, I will say I'll go outside of where I am and say a Le Clos Chablis.
I can feel how torn you are. I can feel that you're like, what do I say? I've got so many options.
Yeah, I know. Hard.
Look, that's why it's such a hard question. And I'm sure you're like me. It depends on the day and really what you feel like you're after. But it's nice to know, you know, when I see you next, which is in a few short days, I think that, you know, I need to sort out and find some Le Clos before I see you.
Well, I look forward to catching up.
Peter, it's such a delight. I really love what you do. I think your whole team is awesome. And it certainly, if anybody puts a handpicked wine on the table, it's always something that I will grab for before anybody else can. So thank you for joining me. I know you're incredibly busy in the winery, so thank you so much for spending some time with me this morning.
Pleasure, Shanteh. Thanks for those kind words. And yeah, great to catch up and chat. And I'll put in a word for Imogen for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Cheers to you.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.